Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Qamar Cheema, and today I'm honored to have with me Dr. Aditi Malhotra. Dr. Aditi is an author of recently new book which has been published by the name of India in the Indo Pacific, Understanding India's Security Orientation towards Southeast and East Asia. Dr. Aditi or Dr. Malhotra, she has been the co-editor for the Journal of Foreign Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies, and now she's transitioning to the new role, which she will tell you in quite some days. And you can look her Twitter profile as well, for that matter. Thank you very much, Dr. Aditi, for your time and for helping us to understand that, so that we can understand that what you have written in your new book.
Thank you, Dr. Chima. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So, Dr. Aditi, in your book, you have basically raised certain questions, and you have been calling that India is a balancer in the Indo-Pacific, and this may not be perfect interpretation for India's role in the region. What is and that, and how do you see India's role in the Indo-Pacific during these days?
Thank you for the question. So, as I argue in the book, that for long we've read and, we've actually kind of believed India to be a balancer in the Indo Pacific. So, the idea has been that India has been balancing China in the Indo Pacific region. But we also don't realize that this is just a part of the picture. Like, this is not the complete picture, because every action that India does, whether security or not, is not driven by the sole factor of balancing China, which is why we realize that a lot of Western scholars are unable to make sense of some of India's actions. They see a discrepancy there, and that's why they argue how India is, either the weakest link in the Quad or not an effective balancer in that sense. So I argue that India, okay, balancing is one part of the equation, but calling India a balancer and studying everything from the lens of balancing may not get you the answers which, say, a foreign policy practitioner or an analyst would want. So in my book, I actually argue against using, the lens of realism, and I actually argue that there is a concept known as a role theory. In role theory, the idea is that every country's role, the role that it perceives for itself, changes over decades or over phases. It could be sudden, it could take time. In India's case, what we have seen over the last 20 years or so, that India's role has incrementally changed in the Indo-Pacific region. So while a lot of people would call India as a balancer, India declares itself not as a balancer for sure, but calls itself a stakeholder in the security and safety of Indo-Pacific, calls itself as a provider of net security or a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, and also calls itself as a major power or a leading power, which I would, of course, go on eventually on what are the nuances, because how a country looks at itself as a major power may also mean different things to different countries. So I kind of argue in the book that India's role has evolved, and today it is more of a leading major power globally, but at the regional level in the Indo-Pacific, it is one of the stakeholders, and in the Indian Ocean, it is more of a provider of net security. Now, how effective India is in these roles is, of course, a matter of debate, which I have dealt with in the book.
Hmm. So, Dr. Aditi, how do you see that you have talked in the book that India's changing security role over the last 2 decades or so in the Asia Pacific region? So, what factors are basically responsible for this change? How do you see that?
So there are a lot of factors. Like in international relations, a lot of students or scholars tend to just look at one factor and say this is the only reason. But in the book, I go into a multitude of factors which come together to actually, compel the Indian leadership to refocus and reinterpret its role. So I look at a lot of internal factors and external factors. Now, some of the factors are constant, like, India's role in the world is also driven a lot because of its geographical location. If India was based in a different geography, clearly it would have had a different outlook towards, the world as such. So one which is a constant determinant is the geography of India, and the other thing is the civilizational history. So there is a sense of 5,000-year-old, civilization, and that also is an ideational factor which influences Indian leadership. Now, what has changed internally over the last 20 years have been two factors that I analyze in the book. One factor is how after the 2000s, internally, India's economic success and India's economic development made it more confident to take up a much larger role in the region. From the 2000s, we see how India's economy is growing and it becomes more interdependent on international trade because of this. As a reason, there are also new security imperatives for India. Like for India, suddenly the focus on seaborne trade or energy import becomes important. Because of which, the Indian Navy, which for many years did not get the kind of importance the Indian Army or the Air Force did, suddenly in the 2000s, we see the Indian leadership interested in the role of the Navy. And that is why we see these changes happening. And within the Navy, also, there is more money with India. So, of course, there are bigger budgets. It just helps India in that sense. And externally, if we look at a lot of external factors, we look that from the 2000s, you have a lot of international attention on India. You have the US and the US allies, which are more willing to engage with India over time. And they want India to be one of the alternatives to China. Of course, this is the foreign expectation and how India kind of includes its own role for itself and how foreign expectation marries them together to actually take up a new role. And in this, what we see from the late 2000s, after 2007 and 8, we also see China playing an important role because China becomes one of the factors which starts influencing India. A lot of people tend to believe that China was always the reason for India. But if you actually look at the trajectory, India was kind of muted or more nuanced in its response to China on security issues. But we see India taking a much more stronger stand after 2007 and 2008. So China becomes one of the other factors as well. So just to boil it down, externally we have US and its allies supporting India. You have China, which is kind of becoming a reason for India to become more stronger as a security actor. And internally, you have more money, you have the Navy, and all these factors come together to actually, reimagine India's security role in the region.
So, Dr. Malhotra, there is a lot of talk that since India's role has increased in the region, and India is over the period of time getting a global attention. Do you think that India is in a position to be the next security provider in the region for smaller countries, maybe in the region? And please do speak on the perspective of the traditional and the non-traditional security, because traditional security is there. But looking at the case of the Sri Lanka, we have seen that this is not just the traditional security, but this is basically the economic security, which basically brought down the entire nation.
That's a very interesting point. So when I actually look at India's role as a provider of net security, interestingly, India has focused mostly on non-traditional security aspects. So one of the biggest benchmarks, or I can say one of the biggest turning points for India was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And that is when we see the Indian Navy and the Indian government getting involved in trying to help out other smaller countries in the neighborhood. And then we see the US, Japan, and Australia, everybody coming together to kind of help India. What was interesting in this case was how India managed to take care of its own problems, as in terms of the disaster due to the tsunami. It managed its own domestic problems and at the same time was willing to help the other countries. And this was the first time that India realized it had a lot of potential when it comes to contributing on non-security issues, which is why over the time, right, we see India kind of getting very much involved in trying to help countries, especially during natural disasters. So India is heavily involved in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, whether we look at 2006, whether we look at 2007. India is involved with Bangladesh, and even in as far as Lebanon, we see India kind of helping people get out of Lebanon. So we start noticing that India is actually gaining more credence as a provider of a non-traditional security aspects. We see search and rescue operations where again the Indian Navy and the Coast Guards have been very active. So India actually has been doing a lot on that sense. However, having said this, a lot of people also argue that is India effective as a provider of net security? Now, I would like to say, like every time a country's role evolves, like we spoke about how India's role has changed over the 2 decades, we also see that there are gaps, there are areas where the country is not able to fully, implement its vision. So if India says that, it's a provider of net security, and mind you, there is a section in the Indian society, in the Indian think tank circle as well, which believes that no, India should not be seen as a provider of net security. However, if we look at the government rhetorics, this is how the government presents itself. But then there are areas wherein India may not be as effective. And that's quite natural for any country because you're always pursuing a role. That role may be achieved sometimes and may not be achieved, but the idea to pursue it is always there. So India's ability and potential exist. It keeps practicing, but then there are areas where there is a lot of scope for improvement.
Okay, so Aditi, you have written obviously about India's security engagement with the countries in the Southeast Asian nations. Recently, you noticed that India launched a missile in Pakistan, which they said that that was accidentally launched. But India is also giving some BrahMos missiles to Philippines as well. So there was a lot of hue and cry, and there was a lot of assessment that shall we buy the Indian military equipment, and what is the credibility of that? Because although I personally believe that that Indian missile launch to Pakistan was not accidental, it was by
Mhm.
design or by plan, and because and many analysts have been saying that. So India's military sales to into the Southeast Asian nations and its security engagements. How do you see that? You have mentioned a lot in your book.
Okay, that again, a lot of things that you've asked, so I'll kind of deal with everything one by one. So I'll begin with ASEAN countries in particular, okay, how they see India as a security actor. Then I'll go down to the specific case of Philippines, and then of course we could discuss about the intention behind or the accidental nature of the BrahMos missile launch. So if we look at ASEAN countries as such, they have been quite open about involving India in the network of countries that already exist. Again, now before I go to that, it's really important to understand how the ASEAN countries operate. Again, the idea of balancing is what is kind of shown that, okay, the ASEAN countries want India to come as a balancer against China, but that's not a very good interpretation of how things are. For ASEAN countries, their intent is to involve a lot of major powers together. It does not mean that it's just single handedly India or single handedly the US. It does not want great power competition in that sense. It does not want that, the US and China or India should fight each other in a manner which is actually unfavorable to the ASEAN countries. So, what they want is that every major power in the region or outside the region should have a stake. Okay, it is a part of a network, should have a stake in the security and the stability of the ASEAN region. So they do not want any one actor to become very strong. Of course, within ASEAN countries, some countries are more pro the US, some of them are more pro China. So you have these actors, but as a whole, most of the ASEAN countries or the ASEAN organization as such does not want to become a victim of great power competition, and is very happy to involve actors from different regions to have a stake. This is where India becomes important. So from the 2000s, we have seen how a lot of ASEAN countries, again, to be very specific, there are some which are more, supportive of India's role. One of them is Vietnam. We also see Singapore, and now we also see, Philippines coming into the fore. So we see how these countries are more open about getting India involved. However, there is also a limit to that. It is not that the Vietnamese or people from Singapore would want Indian military assets, placed there or having coming in a manner which is kind of detrimental to their interest. They're very happy with port calls, they are very happy with periodic presence, but they do not want India, or for that matter, a lot of other countries, to get intertwined in a manner that they do not have a say in the regional security sector. So in this case, if we look at it, India is just one of the actors from the bigger network that ASEAN wants to build. A lot of scholars in India and even outside tend to portray that India is like the only country that Vietnam wants to reach out to. But again, I would say India is one of those actors which a lot of countries would want get involved. But even in this, again, as I said, there are some countries which are more pro-China, so they do not favor India's increased involvement. So unless and until you do not have consensus from the region for India to play a stronger security role, India will not be able to do that. And even India has some inhibitions in becoming a much more involved security actor, specifically in the ASEAN region, because it has its own interests majorly in the Indian Ocean. You have primary areas of interest and you have secondary area of interest. So India does not want to stretch its assets and its military presence to a level which becomes difficult to sustain over time. So there is this dichotomy between what do the regional actors want India to do versus what can India do. Because of this, we do see India involved in a lot of aspects when it comes to dealing with these countries in coordinated patrols along the Indian Ocean or along the different international seas. But we do not see India getting involved to a great extent on that, a lot of issues, right? Like India is opposed to the idea of having joint patrolling with the US in the region. Now I'll come to the third part. Okay, so in case I skip on anything, just feel free to remind me. So because of this is one aspect. Now the other aspect is, for many decades, India has been importing weapons and weapon systems. It has never been an exporter of any major weapon systems as such. But this has changed over the years. So India's previous policy was to not export weapons to countries with the intent that it could be used in an armed conflict. That is why it has been wary of giving weapons to a lot of countries. Having said that, it's also important to know that India's own defense, domestic indigenous efforts are not that great, right? They have systemic problems. So it's not that India can produce weapons on its own whenever it wants. There are a lot of domestic problems on that front as well, which is why it has imported. So in the last decade, we see India becoming interested to being an exporter. And why is this important? Because you not only get money, which is important for you to focus on indigenization of, production of military systems, but it also kind of, plays into the larger vision of India as being a provider of net security in the region. So it kind of plays two things. So it's not that it's just symbolic in nature. And if you're able to build on it, and if you're able to make it a good industry, of course, it's a lot of money. And that money can be used for a lot of other purposes in India as well. So this is why we see India becoming really active on this front. Specifically on the BrahMos, of course, you would know that it's a joint program between India and Russia. And that is one of those missiles which has kind of made its name as a credible missile when it comes to, regional security landscape, which is why for India, promoting the BrahMos is a good thing, because there is greater credibility of BrahMos as opposed to some other systems that exist. So it is one of the most sellable missiles in that sense. And for Philippines, of course, it's easier to get something which is at a cheaper rate as compared to what you can ask from the West, because those are always higher. And then Philippines wants to get involved in kind of diversifying, the suppliers of its own weapons and arms. So in that sense, again, India becomes crucial. So this is why I guess, there is a transaction on that front. Now, talking about the missile, the whole fiasco that we saw. Again, I would say we do not have a lot of information outside, which is sad because it leads to greater speculation. But I can just say that based on my conversations with some insiders in India, I asked what was the bigger thing? The problem that was told to me was to do with something which was related to software, because of which when there was a simulation exercise, they actually accidentally, which to me is also bizarre to a great extent, because it is scary, right? Because it kind of tells you that, okay, so even if there is no intention, sometimes things can go horribly wrong. So what actually happened? That is India's explanation. Again, everyone can speculate on what the reasons may be, but I think the problem is, regardless of the intention or the accident. The question that rises is that these are genuine dangers in South Asia, because when we're talking about something of this sort, miscalculation or an accident, this could even happen during a conflict. And when
Yeah.
that happens, then the intention or not being an intention does not play a part, because it leads to greater escalation in that sense. So it disturbs the escalation dynamics. So that would be my answer. If I've left out on anything, just feel free.
You covered everything. You have a good memory, by the way. So, Dr. Malhotra, moving towards a couple of more questions, a couple of questions I have for you for this discussion. Uh, we have seen that India has been engaged with the Australia, with the Americans and the Japan on this Quad. So, how do you see the strategic engagements of India in this Quad arrangement? And obviously, the Quad is doesn't have a military component. So, how do you see that this engagement is there, and what benefits India is getting? It seems that India is getting a lot of security incentives from United States in terms of BK agreement, and there's a lot of capacity building which is coming from the United States. So how do you see the strategic engagement as far as this Quad arrangement is concerned?
Okay. To begin with, I must admit it's good to hear, you saying that it does not have a military component, because everyone calls the Quad a security dialogue, and it's not so for sure. So when it comes to Quad, we've seen the rise of Quad, we've seen its demise, and we've seen the re-rise of Quad in the recent years. What the Quad does, okay, now of course I can't talk about the Quad or the Indo Pacific without mentioning the tragedy that we saw today with the sad passing away of the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, who was actually the father or the architect of the idea of Indo Pacific. Back when no one spoke about the idea of Indo Pacific, he was the one to bring the idea of the confluence of two seas. And he also promoted the concept, which eventually came to be known as the Quad, as we see it today. So I think that, being said, the idea of Quad and the Indo-Pacific started in 2006 and 7, again coming from Japan, and it gained a lot of traction. And we have seen how, again, within the Quad, India's role has evolved. Initially, it was largely seen as a security arrangement. We saw India getting involved in a lot of military exercises, with the Quad partners. And we also saw over time, in the recent years, we've seen how India has played a more constructive role by kind of helping with the vaccine distribution as a part of the Quad grouping. So, what the Quad intends, again, it's still evolving. What it is today may not be so after 10 years, it is evolving with time. But what the Quad does is to offer a lot of regional countries an alternate model as opposed to the China model in Asia or in the Indo-Pacific region. What India, the kind of role that India can play in this is not just by contributing towards capacity building of regional states and little states in the Indo-Pacific region, but it also kind of is one of the platforms to enhance India's position in the region, right? It is not just to enhance India's security role as such, but to enhance India's contribution to a lot of aspects. Like we see joint programs between India and Japan in Africa, right? So the Quad has like a big scope, and India keeps picking and choosing in areas where it can contribute. And what the Quad does is, of course, helps India position itself as a relevant stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific, and also present an alternate to the China model, which exists and that we've seen with the BRI initiative.
So, Aditi, how do you see that since the everyone is putting a lot of attention towards Indo-Pacific, and according to the CIPRI report, the global investment on the defense has increased. So I think somewhere around $2.1 trillion are being spent, and that was, I think, I was reading that that is $268 per capita if it is divided
Mhm.
globally. So, do you think that there is some sort of any limited scale conflict between China and India? And do you think that India will have to fight this battle alone, or the Quad countries are going to help India?
Wow.
What does your research says?
It's interesting. I wish I could actually answer with a definite thing, because that would be kind of me predicting the future, if only I could. But if you look at India and China, right, even though there's a lot of discussion about the Quad and the Indo Pacific and the India China, we always talk about everything in the same sentence. But it's very important to realize, and you would also see this in the recent years, how India wants to keep the India China bilateral equation, away from these initiatives, whether it is Quad or Indo Pacific. That does not mean that they do not have anything to do with each other. Of course, China is an important factor for India to, reposition itself, whether as a part of the Quad arrangement or as an Indo Pacific actor. However, India does not want its problem with China in that sense to become a victim to, again, outside actors, which is why we see that even when, India and China, of course, they are, still facing the standoff. It's ongoing since 2020. We see how the Indian officials have been, requesting the American officials not to mention China in, statements and such when it comes to the India China, problems. That kind of shows how India wants to have a nuanced take on it. When it comes to India China problem, it's anything could go wrong, because there is already a standoff, and there are high chances, not now, not tomorrow, but eventually, that there would be, and maybe, a limited scale conflict between the two. I think until and unless things do not go out of India's hand in that sense, right, it would not want to directly involve other actors, whether it is the US and its allies. Having said that, this does not mean that India would go against the capacity building opportunities that it has from the Western countries. Because for India, diversification has always been important. And that is where you see India being open to a lot of capacity building help, because of course, its own military needs to modernize more effectively and faster than what was actually anticipated before. So in that sense, India is willing to take that help, but it would not want to involve the Quad actors directly or the Indo Pacific actors directly when it comes to the India China conflict or the India China dispute as such.
So, Aditi, in your book, since you have evaluated India's, this is my last question, by the way.
Mhm.
I don't want to increase and enhance this interview too much, prolong this interview. Uh, in your research, what have you calculated? Do you think that with this growing GDP and the potential the Indian economy has, and the way they are putting a lot of money on defense, somewhere around, I think, $76.6 billion, third highest in the world, I think, in terms of in military spending, and then obviously a third largest in terms of the purchasing power parity. How do you see India? Do you think India is a mid-sized power? Do you see India as a regional power, or do you see India as a great power in next 2 decades? What is your calculation? What is your understanding, and what you have concluded in your book?
Mhm. So again, there are two parts to this. One of it is, India's military rise and the military modernization. What's interesting is when we look at the headlines, we always see how India is investing so much in the military, but the question always prevails that how effectively is India modernizing, right? Because if you look at the major chunk of money, sadly, it is not going in India's acquisitions or, arms buildup. It's mostly being diverted to a lot of to the pensions, okay, to the expenses of the personnel. And we, even in this, we see the Indian army taking the major chunk, with the Indian Air Force as the second, and we see the Indian Navy. So as much as India is investing in terms of the military budget, a lot of it does not go to acquisitions, because of which I think, that there is a gap between India's military modernization vision and what it is actually able to implement. And because of the whole Russia-Ukraine war, now we are seeing that India is, the supplies that used to come from Russia, I'm not saying it would stop, but it would get delayed because of a lot of reasons. And India would be forced to, not just diversify its suppliers, but at the same time indigenize efforts to build its own weapon systems and arms. And this is where it seeks more help from the Western actors, because it's not as rosy a picture as a lot of people would like it to like to believe it. Now, the second part, where do we see India in the next 20 years? Personally, a great part, I guess that is a big, like, that is way too ambitious, because I do not think that in the next 20 years India can implement its roles so effectively that it kind of replaces or even supplements the other great powers. I do not personally consider India to be a great power in that sense, where it has influence all over the globe. But I say yes, at the regional level, India will continue to remain a crucial regional actor in the Indo Pacific. It will become a much more stronger actor in the Indian Ocean region as such. And it will be spending the next 20 years trying to address the gaps that exist in terms of India's security role. So we will see the current trajectory with more greater efforts towards being a more effective security actor. And the last thing would be where the US China equation go, because a lot of where India stands is also relevant at the international circuit based on how India compares to China, right? So until and unless the China threat stays for the US and its allies, India will continue from their perspective to be a very crucial actor, which is why we see a lot of patience when it comes to India, and we see a lot of incremental and fast engagement of India from the Western actors.
Hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Aditi Malhotra, for helping us to understand the book which you have written, India in the Indo-Pacific, Understanding India's Security Orientation Towards Southeast and East Asia. Obviously, my viewers may enjoy your discussion, and they can share the comments as well. But obviously, this was a very academic talk, and thank you very much for writing a book and coming up with a woman's perspective to India's power, because largely these perspectives are dominated by men. So more power to you, and more power to the women in India and across the world for coming up or having an influence in international politics. Thank you very much, Aditi, for your time and for your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Cheema. And just one last thing, the book is open access. So even
Yeah,
if you don't want to buy the print copy, feel free to access the book and read it as a digital version. And thank you
sure,
so
please.
much for having me.
Sure, please. All those who are watching, please do get the book and do see the book, and you will enjoy. Thank you.